Welcome to the Fuel Pulse Show podcast, where we talk about all things fuel for all kinds of people. I'm your host, Eric Bjornstad, your guide through the ever-changing world of fuel. Whether you're in a job where you manage fuel that you need to use to get the job done, like at a hospital or a commercial fleet, or you simply have a car and a truck and a generator at home, the Fuel Pulse Show podcast is for you. So, what are we going to talk about today? Well, anyone who deals with stored fuel knows that microbial contamination is pretty much an inevitable problem they're going to have to deal with, or at least they should know that. And it used to be that before the influx of ultra low sulfur diesel around 2006, dealing with microbes in stored fuel and fuel storage tanks was kind of an afterthought. But people are now finding out that we're in a very different time. And it's a very different environment when it comes to that. Yet it can be kind of hard to let go of old assumptions and past logic when it comes to things with our fuel. So, what we're going to talk about today are some of the, let's call them microbial myths that have persisted in the fuel management industry. And by that, we mean misconceptions about the problem of microbial contamination in stored fuel. These kinds of misconceptions are holdovers from a past time when fuels were different and conditions were different, the rules were different. And these misconceptions can be damaging because these mistaken myths might lead us to believe, let's say, that the problem isn't really serious, could lead us to believe that our particular situation places us outside of the risk zone for microbial contamination when in fact we're very much in the risk zone, so to speak, or the misconceptions might lead us to try the wrong thing to solve a microbe problem that we think we have. So we want to start addressing some of these microbial myths. Now, we're not going to get through all of them, or not even most of them. Partly because there are so many of them, and also partly because we don't want this to be a 6-hour podcast episode. So we're going to do one myth per episode so that it doesn't get too long, and so that we can make sure that we cover all the important stuff so that everyone has a full understanding of what the biggest myths of microbes and fuel are and what the real truth about them actually is. So the first myth that we're going to start off with is the myth that controlling water will control microbes in your stored fuel. Now, this myth was long held for decades before low and ultra low sulfur diesel fuels came about. If you were to go back to, let's say, the 1950s, you can see the United States Army having a fuel manual where they talk about monitoring and removing free water phases will prevent establishment of microbial contamination problems in most cases. But times have changed. This is not the 1950s anymore. Times have changed. The fuel properties have changed, and that kind of advice no longer applies. I can almost guarantee the Army does not say that anymore. Yet this old way of thinking continues to persist. So let's talk about why that old way of thinking no longer applies to us today. So before we continue, though, we should clarify. We should start adding some context and clarify a key difference when we talk about removing water in order to control microbes. So on the one hand, when we talk about that, we could actually be making a claim that keeping or removing free water will get rid of an existing microbial contamination problem. In other words, we might be claiming that removing water is a way to kill and make a microbe problem go away. That the way to do that, the way to get rid of an existing problem is just remove the water. That's all you have to do. So that, on the one hand, that could be what we mean when we say that. On the other hand, we could really be saying or making a claim that if we can keep water out of the tank environment, out of the fuel distribution system environment, if we can do that, then that is the best way to keep a microbial problem from establishing itself in the future. So, two different kinds of claims there. So, let's talk about them. The first claim, that removing water kills microbes, that claim is pretty much categorically false. If microbes have established themselves in your system, then removing whatever free water happens to be there alongside them is not just going to make those microbes die and disappear. And as we're going to see later, there are a number of reasons why that's true, why this won't happen. But removing water from an existing microbial problem situation is not going to solve that particular problem. And then for the second claim does have a small grain of truth to it. But as with many other things, there are nuances that we have to acknowledge. Now, it's true that the less free water you have around, the less chance that microbes have to grow. That is true, categorically speaking. And we'll talk a little bit more about that relationship here later on. But it is also true that it's really difficult to keep all the water out of a tank or a system. And as we're going to see later, if you can't bank on doing exactly that, then you should not assume that all you have to do is keep the water out in order to prevent microbe problems. So, in the context of microbes living in fuel storage tanks or fuel systems, I know it is shocking, but microbes do actually need water to be able to do certain important things. First of all, they need it for hydration. I mean, just like all living organisms, microbes do require a certain level of hydration, certain level of water in order to function. So, water for them, it's essential to maintaining the structure and the function of their cells. If they do not have water, those cells can become what they call desiccated. They can dry out and they can actually lose their ability to carry out metabolic processes. So, microbes do need water in that respect. And water is helpful because it also acts as a universal solvent. And what we're getting at when we say that is that if you have free water around, then it will transport certain kinds of molecules, certain kinds of nutrients that the microbes need to use in order to grow and to multiply. So in fuel storage tanks, what tends to happen is that the microbes will pull certain things from the water or use water in a certain way for what they need to do. And then they will also take hydrocarbons from the fuel and they will use the hydrocarbons as a carbon source. And so what they do is they need to have that water around to dissolve and transport those hydrocarbons to the microbial cells. So having water around is also useful for the microbes in that respect. Then also, microbes, they are living cells, so they have biochemical reactions that happen within them that need water to be used as a medium to drive these reactions. They also use water in the enzymatic reactions and in their electron transport chains and in all those other metabolic processes that are essential for the microbial cell's energy production and growth. And then lastly, they can actually use water as a medium for their own movement, their own transport. If you have a free water phase next to a microbial colony, that is a big help to them because they will actually move around in that microbial phase. They will use that to move themselves to different parts, different areas in the tank that, let's say, might have more food, might have more nutrients available to them. And then also, having a free water phase also is used by the microbes to help them disperse themselves within the tank and travel to new areas and form new colonies in the tank. So, in all these ways, having free water around is a good thing. It's an important thing for microbes. But once we acknowledge that, we have to move past that and we have to get to this idea that if you get rid of all that free water, then that means that microbes can't grow. That, remember, that's the myth. That's the outdated logic. Yes, microbes need this free water to grow. It's important. So if you get rid of that free water, they're not going to grow. That's the myth. If there's no free water, then the microbes can't survive. And that is a myth that is not true for several reasons. Let's talk about those. First, as we've already been alluding to, it's almost impossible to keep all the water out of a tank. That is true whether you mean keeping water from getting into the tank, or if you mean removing all the water that happens to be there. See, removing all the free water from a tank that's already there is virtually, I'll keep saying virtually impossible, simply because it keeps me from saying next to impossible. It's virtually impossible for the simple fact that few storage tanks, above ground or underground, are designed to enable you to do that effectively. Many of these tanks are designed with baffles and lots of areas where pockets of water can basically hide. So even if you have an above ground fuel storage tank that has a bottom drain, I mean, those are good, but even if you have that and you use that, there's still going to be pockets of water that are left behind. And microbes, one thing we have to realize is that microbes do not need very much water around in order to start growing. I mean, think about this. Think about a tank, a storage tank, and there's a almost a film of water at the bottom. Let's say it's an eighth of an inch. If you have a ruler, if you were to look at an eighth of an inch, there's not very much. In fact, it is too small to be detected if you were to try to stick the tank with water paste. You wouldn't be able to detect that. So even if you have a tank with an eighth of an inch of water, how much is that really when you talk about how much water microbes need to grow? Well, there's a helpful illustration that we can use that gives us some good perspective on this. And that is that if you have an eighth of an inch of water and you have a microbe that is, let's say it's standing at the bottom of this eighth of an inch little film of water, the size perspective, the size comparison between that eighth of an inch of water and that little microbe there is about the same as if you had took one person and you put them at the foot of Mount Everest and they're looking up at Mount Everest. That's basically the kind of size differential that we're looking for. So once you realize that, then if someone says, well, an eighth of an inch of water is not really going to be enough for microbes. No, of course it's more than enough. And I mean, it's plenty of water for a microbial colony or any number of microbial colonies to use and start growing. So that's the first misconception about free water and microbes. You can say that you're just going to remove all the water, but it's really almost, next to impossible to actually really do that. Second misconception is microbes actually do not have to have free water in order to do their thing. See, microbes in fuel storage tanks and distribution systems, they can still multiply in the presence of emulsified water, even if there's no free or visible water phase there. Now, emulsified water is what happens when you get tiny droplets of water dispersed throughout the fuel phase. Remember, fuel and water. Fuel and water normally do not mix because fuel is basically like oil. Remember, diesel fuel is basically diesel fuel oil. It's a non-polar substance. Water is a polar substance. Normally, they do not combine and stay combined. But when certain things happen and you get an emulsion formed, then you'll get tiny droplets of water that are suspended in that fuel and you'll get an emulsion. That's what happens when you have like hazy fuel, for example. So the water may not be a separate layer of free water that's sitting on the bottom of the tank. Instead, it could be existing as just a phase of small little droplets, what they call micro emulsions, micro droplets of water that are dispersed in that fuel. And um, that kind of situation is enough moisture in many cases for microbes still to grow and thrive and multiply under the right conditions. Now, why is that? Well, the first thing we have to realize is that microbes are highly adaptable. Good for us, right? Microbes are highly adaptable. They have the ability to utilize water in all different forms, including emulsified water. Many kinds of microbes have evolved in order to be able to extract the minimum moisture content that's present in emulsified water so that they can support their growth. So they don't actually need free water to grow if they have some amount of emulsified water around. So that's point number one. Another reason why microbes don't need free water around in all circumstances is that when you have an emulsion, when you have a layer of emulsified water, that actually creates what they call a microenvironment. You'll get this little microenvironment within the fuel, in that area of the fuel, and within that microenvironment, that's enough moisture content to support microbial growth, especially when that microenvironment happens to be close or in close proximity, as they say, to the microbial population, such as when you have let's say, rag layer that where you have a layer of free water, right, and you have uh, microbes growing at the interface between the fuel and the free water. And then there's typically a layer of microemulsion there. Well, that's a microenvironment, and the microbes, if they had to, if you took away all of that free water, they could still live in that microemulsion because there's plenty enough moisture in that particular microenvironment for them to have what they need to have in order to carry out the metabolic processes and live their lives, so to speak. So the bottom line is that even when we acknowledge the reality that there's almost always going to be some free water hanging around in a fuel system, microbes do not have to rely just on that if there's any fuel water emulsion of any kind in another place in that system. That's going to be plenty enough water for those microbes to use. But perhaps the biggest reason why getting all the free water out does not make microbial problems go away is because of the way that microbes are able to use the biomass and the biofilms that they produce. They will use those to survive without free water. They will use that biomass as a source of nutrients and energy so that they can survive, they can grow, even if they're in an environment that now has very low or no free water at all, because let's say you tried to take it out. See, we have to remember, again, go back to this point, microbes are highly adaptable, remember that. They can access moisture and they can access the life essential nutrients they need. They can get those from a bunch of different sources, including the organic matter that makes up biofilms. The biofilms that they've made, they will provide a food source for the microbes. The microbes will produce extracellular enzymes. Those enzymes will break down the biofilms into simpler compounds. The microbes then take those, they use those as a source of carbon and energy and nutrients. And then they will also extract whatever moisture content happens to be in that biofilm, which there is some. And so, even if you've taken away all that free water out of their environment, if there's biofilm in that tank environment, the microbes will just default to using that to get what they need. So if there's not a lot of moisture around, that does not mean all the microbes die off. There are many kinds of microbes that have adapted themselves to be able to grow in low moisture environments. Now, to be fair, the kind of growth we're talking about from those microbes in those low moisture environments, that kind of growth is typically slower than compared to an environment with a lot of water, but it's still there. So the microbes in those kind of low moisture environments, such as when you took all that water out, what they will do is they'll enter a dormant phase. They may even form spores, enter what they call a spore forming state, because they need to conserve energy during that period. So they will do that. And then when conditions become more favorable, such as When free water comes back into the system, and if you've managed tanks before, you know there's any number of ways for that to happen. When free water comes back into that system, it reactivates those microbes, makes them metabolically active again, and they go right back to doing what they were doing before. Now, so it's worth noting, we have to emphasize this. When we talk about microbes being able to use biomass or other organic matter to survive in a low moisture condition, this is not something that is news to the industry. It is a what they call a well-documented phenomenon. These microbes that do this, they have adapted to what's available to them. And this adaptation that they have created, it allows these microbes to persist and to live in a wide range of environments, including fuel systems that don't have a lot of moisture available. Now, speaking of adaptations, having talked about how all these different kinds of microbes have learned to adapt and flourish and change and live in all different situations and circumstances. By now, having said all of this, by now we should realize that the microbial world is more complex than we can imagine. And so, using generalities like if you get rid of all the water, you will get rid of the microbes. Generalities like that are, to be diplomatic, they are vast oversimplifications of the truth, of the reality. See, scientists estimate that there could be 1 trillion species of microbes on planet Earth, and we've only discovered and been able to identify maybe 10 million of those. That's way less than 1%. Now, granted, scientists think the majority of these undiscovered species are actually found deep down in the ocean. But the point is that for every kind of microbe that you think is living in your tank and that it's going to go away if you don't have any water around, for every kind of microbe that's in there that's like that, there's probably 5 other kinds of microbes that don't mind that kind of environment and will gladly come and take their place. So you're not going to get rid of a microbial problem simply by getting rid of whatever water you think you can find in a storage tank. The idea that simply getting rid of the water is going to make those microbial problems go away, that's just not how real life works. Taking away the water might make it difficult for some kinds of microbes to grow and to reproduce, but there's plenty enough of other kinds of microbes that you're not going to see microbe problems go away simply by removing the water. No, the only way to make a microbe problem actually go away is to use a biocide chemical in the fuel and the fuel system. You use that biocide to kill the microbes. Now, fortunately, there are multiple options available on that front. You have some choices there to pick the right kind of biocide that's best for your situation. But using a biocide is the only way to solve a microbe problem. Getting rid of the water alone is not going to make the kind of difference that the old logic thinks that it will. So, that is the first big microbial myth that we want to dispel. The myth that you can solve or prevent microbial problems in fuel and fuel systems or storage tanks simply by removing free water and keeping it out. As we've seen, it most definitely does not work that way anymore. And so that is going to do it for this episode of the Fuel Pulse Show podcast. You will find links to all the things we talked about in the show notes. If you have not done so already, please subscribe to the show at your favorite podcast application, whatever you use. Better yet, if you haven't done so already, feel free to leave a review because the reviews do help us a lot. And so with that, I am your host, Eric Bjornstad, and I will see you next time for the next episode of the Fuel Pulse Show podcast.